Everyone, thanks for joining today's webinar on the pros and cons of virtual versus in-person interaction for older adults. I'm Mark Mather with PRB, and PRB works in collaboration with the Coordinating Center on the Demography and Economics of Aging, Alzheimer's disease, and related dementias at the University of Michigan. And our goal is to help publicize research on the health and well-being of older adults. And Amanda Soniga is here. She directs the Coordinating Center. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a chance to say a few words, Amanda, about the Coordinating Center.
Yeah, so I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I also want to thank the National Institute on Aging for their support. So as Mark said, the Coordinating Center, well, he didn't say this, but anyway, the Coordinating Center performs a range of functions that are aimed at facilitating communication and collaboration across the 15 centers on the demography and economics of aging and AD/RD across the 15 centers and also across the NIA center programs. All 15 of the demography and economic centers fund important pilot research. And as Mark said, one of the goals of the Corning Center in collaboration with the Population Reference Bureau is to help the centers share their findings with the public and the research community. So our colleagues at PRB have created a range of publications that feature center research across a wide range of topics, and these are all available on the Coordinating Center website, agingcenters.org. We've also tried to foster cross-center collaboration by highlighting research that performed by the centers in our series of cross-center webinars. And I really want to thank Mark and his terrific staff at PRB for organizing and hosting these events, including the one today. So again, very happy to have you all here and looking, as the rest of us, really looking forward to the talks today.
Thanks, Amanda. I also want to thank my PRB colleague, Toshiko Kaneda, for helping to organize this event. And Lillian Kilduff is here in case we have any technical issues. I'm very excited to introduce our three speakers today, and Toshiko will put links to their full bios in the chat. Karen Fingerman is the Sonia Wilson Professor of Human Development and Family Sciences at UT Austin. She also directs the Texas Aging and Longevity Consortium and the NIA-funded Center on Aging and Population Sciences. She'll be followed by Nell Compernolle, who's Senior Research Scientist at NORC at the University of Chicago. And then we have Steve Cole, who is a Professor of Medicine and Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences in the UCLA School of Medicine. And our speakers today are going to talk about how social media and new technologies can enhance or limit social connectedness and emotional well-being among older adults. And this is definitely a topic that remains extremely relevant given rapidly evolving technology. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We are going to save the Q&A until the end, and we encourage people to use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and then we can unmute you so you can ask your questions. Or you can type your questions into the question box at any time. Closed captioning is available as an option at the bottom of your screen there. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send you a link to that recording after the event. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Karen.
Great. Is everybody seeing my slides okay?
Yes.
Great. I'm going to go ahead then. And I want to say that most of the research I'm going to present today was done by my absolutely brilliant trainees, postdocs, and grad students. And so everything brilliant in it should be credited to them, and all of the errors should be credited to me. So let me go ahead, though, and tell you what we've learned. I'm going to start by just introducing the topic. And one of the most interesting phenomena in the field of both psychology and aging is that social relationships have a strong impact on well-being. Having a wide array of social ties is good for cognitive functioning, good for psychological well-being, good for physical health, and even predicts mortality and survival. So this is a very well-known, well-cited meta-analysis, which shows that aspects of social relationships have a stronger impact on survival than the usual suspects: smoking, obesity, alcohol. It's one of the strongest, if not the strongest predictor. And that's what got me into this field. I have been looking at that for quite a while and been very interested in it. In terms of this webinar, what I wonder is, can technologically mediated social media contribute to these effects? Or do you need to have in-person contact? And so that's what I think one of the biggest, that's the topic we're all aiming for. In a modern world where we now have a lot of different options, what are those options? Do they all contribute equally? Do some contribute in different facets? Since I'm sort of introducing today, I do want to start out by just showing you some of the Pew Research Center data, looking at, for example, social media use. Facebook is the most used amongst older adults. A little over half use it. We can basically take that as the proxy for engagement with social media. So slightly over half, but a good 41% do not use it. We have a little bit more than that who watch movies, for what that's worth. I have a whole other thing on watching TV, which I suspect that's part of, and it's not terribly social. What about video chat? I get that question a lot. We don't have good data on that. My colleague Jared Benj did one of those quick studies during the pandemic when we all had 6 weeks before it was going to end, so we jumped in the field quickly. And he collected some data from a very nearby retirement community. This tends to be well-educated. If anyone's going to be engaged in it, it's going to be this group. And what we find is that about 59% are really not using it. If you're using it once a month or less, it is not a form of social engagement that's affecting your well-being. And so we really, even during the lockdown, even our most well-educated, well-off people, mostly not using video chat. We don't have more recent data, but that was probably among the peak. I do know of some other studies regarding the change during that, and we could talk about that later. I'm going to talk, though, now about my research on this topic. And we ran the Daily Experiences and Wellbeing Study with much gratitude to NIA for the funding and support. We had over 300 people in the greater Austin area, which includes urban, suburban, and rural areas. They participated in a 2-hour initial interview, and we have a lot of data in that interview. And we have BMI, we have dynamometer, we have a lot of indicators. We even have photos of the room where they live and so on. I'm only going to talk about the social network data, which was a huge focus of the study. We then had a 5-day intensive data collection. During that, the study provided them with smartphones, because I could also show you the data that a good chunk of older adults don't have smartphones, and those might be our target group in terms of loneliness and isolation. So we provided it, we trained them, and so on. They wore an Actical, which is like a very precise Fitbit. And then we also used the electronically activated recorder app that captures sound in the environment for 30 seconds out of every 7 minutes. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the language analysis we did from that. We transcribed it and used some software to analyze it. On all of this, we have a lot of publications that are not about the technology media, but that's where I'm going to focus today. Okay, so I told you I was going to talk about the social networks. We have several measures, but I'm going to talk about the one that captures who you feel close to. So this is the network. It's the Convoy measure, widely used measure of assessment. And it's an assessment that captures people who are close and important to you. There are 3 concentric circles. The innermost is you cannot even imagine life without, and the outer are still important and close enough they need to be included in the circles. Just to keep things, so you can follow them in my talk, I'm just going to talk about the whole network. These are people you feel close to. Okay, what do we do in this momentary assessment? So every 3 hours, your phone kind of, gives you a little bing, and you go on and do your little survey. So we had them rate the 10 partners from the Convoy. Did you see them? Then we have data on the quality of the engagement. Was it pleasant? Was it stressful? And so on. Up to 6 additional people. So if you didn't have close people you interacted with, the mode of contact, and this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to focus on that. We know if they're in a group or they're just with one other partner, or actually we know if they're alone. They also did some ratings of mood and loneliness. We have other things. We know their activities and so on, but this is where I'm going to focus our attention today. Okay. At any given time, this is just an average. Oh, this is the average for the whole network, about 15. The average at those 3-hour assessments for negative mood, which was a 5-item scale, not terribly negative, but we do have variability, and we have within-person variability. So sometimes you're less negative than others, which is key. And positive mood the same way. These are on 1 to 5 scales. Be positive, life is good, but it's not always great. So that's what we're seeing, both between person and within person. Okay, this is the percent of assessments. So we have around, I think, 3,500 assessments. 77% of the time, our participants are with someone else. And yes, that differs by whether you're living with people and marital status and so on. And we can dig deeper than that, maybe in the discussion part of the panel. About a third of the time they're on the phone. And interestingly, at 16% of assessments, they're on social media. So that's kind of interesting. It does mean, a lot of people aren't on social media, but that was actually a little higher than we were expecting at that time. Okay, first question is, if you're lonely, do you engage in some kind of social contact? So when I'm feeling lonely, is that when I reach out to someone or go and engage? And the answer was no, although amongst the covariates, and again, I could show you, we found this during COVID lockdown in particular, the afternoon is the period when people are least lonely. And that might gel with, just the way you experience your day. You're a little lonelier in the morning, a little lonelier at night, and afternoon tends to be our peak social engagement. So we did find that, but we did not find that, gee, I'm lonely, let's go get social contact. But we found at the same 3-hour assessment. So this is like at 9 in the morning, I ask you and you say, yeah, I'm kind of lonely. And then I assess you at noon and you were no more likely to have been in your social contact. Now at noon, I say, hey, who did you see and how are you feeling? And if you're with other people, you say, hey, I'm feeling less lonely than I did, a few hours ago. Phone and digital did not. And in fact, in one of our other studies, phone was associated with more loneliness, and I think we see that elsewhere as well. So we're not getting a great effect there from anything but in person. Okay, so loneliness does not appear to motivate social contact. It seems like it's part of your daily schedule that has a stronger impact on when you have social contact. But in-person contact seems to mitigate loneliness, and it seems to have a unique effect that you were not getting the substitute by phone and digital in this study. Okay, why would that be? Well, I promised you I'd look at our language a little bit. So what we did is we were wondering if people express different degrees of emotion in these different modes of contact. And in this case, because we're using oral recordings, we're going to compare phone and in person. And what we find is that people are positive on the phone or in person, but negative emotion shows up more in person. And we're speculating on this. We're still working through the peer review process on this paper. But what we're speculating in part is that it allows for a higher degree of intimacy, and that negative expression on both ends is a way in which you bond socially. And here it may be a little more both superficial and a little more purpose-driven. Often there's a reason for a phone call. But this we thought was important in terms of one of the differences in what's going on. Okay. But what about if you don't have anyone to get together with, right? So maybe I told you earlier, hey, maybe this differs whether you're living alone. I know that Nell's going to talk even more about that. I'm just going to look at what about if you have a big network or a small network? What about if you're with people or not with people? Okay, can social media substitute? So far, that prior study said, you got to be in person, you got to be able to express your positive and negative, get intimate, and so on. Okay, what if you don't have as many people to get together with in person? Well, what we find here is that social media it looks like it's associated with positive mood for people with a small network. So up here, you have a nice big network. You use social media. This is actually not significant. It doesn't really matter. You've got this big network out there. When you use it, when you don't use it, doesn't matter. But okay, I've got my little network, and look at this. I've been on social media a lot, and I'm feeling more positive. Okay. Okay, now we have something a little different. We're doing this at the day level because of the use of social media being somewhat smaller. So if you spend the whole day alone, social media is not having much effect on your negative mood. But so if you're spending it alone, but if you're spending it with someone and you're on social media, that decreases your negative mood, which is kind of, I don't know, complicated, right? Because now I'm alone and I'm using social media and I'm still just as negative and I'm up here being negative, but I'm with you and we're sitting here together and we're looking on my Facebook page, at my grandchildren, and it's just great. We're less negative. I'm less negative because you're there and I'm on social media. Here's one of the questions is, what's the point? I just inferred that what we're doing together is we're looking at my grandchildren. And this is a key point. And there's some literature that is not specific in my data at this point, but the literature shows that one of the things that can happen in this particular cohort is that they're younger. So if you're taking our people in their 80s, it's their younger relatives who are maintaining their technology for them. And that's who they're following on social media. So in some ways, there's a redundancy. If I have a bunch of young people I'm close to, I can be on social media. I don't need to be on social media because I have a whole bunch of young people I'm close to. So there's a little bit there. It's not our target population for intervention. And so that's kind of what's missing is, what are we doing with it? Okay. I do want to jump because I have just a couple more minutes. And I think this is the missing piece that you are all wondering. Is what about AI? Okay, so I can't get in Facebook with all my little likes and dislikes and whatever and get myself feeling better, but surely I can have a chatbot. So I did the research, and here's what I found when I did my first pass at it. AI chatbots provide companionship, engage in meaningful conversations, offer cognitive stimulation, remind about tasks, reduce isolation, and connect older adults to resources, helping them feel valued, supported, and less lonely in daily life. And my source was ChatGPT, because I asked it, hey, what does AI do for, older adults? And this was the answer it gave me. So I did what a good GPT user would do. And I said, okay, give me citations, because I want to know you didn't just make that up for yourself. And it did. And I went through a lot of those citations. But here, the findings are kind of mixed. There are positive attitudes towards the chatbot after engaging with it. Well, maybe that's some novelty and things, and maybe it's a little bit of, we do anything in an experiment that's pretty pleasant, and people say, yeah, that was pretty pleasant. People don't like to listen to the chatbot. They like to talk to it. So people said, older adults said, well, I loved telling it good things happening to me, and it said, that's great, but I didn't like it when it told me the good things that were happening to it. Socially isolated people began to engage with the chatbot, and then they began to exclude real human interactions. In all these studies, the samples are select, and the ones that work may not scale up. So I think this is a big, lot of fun, maybe not going to get us there, because the people who might need to learn to engage are engaging with the chatbot that is really more or less a very affirming diary. So I do want to tell you that my vote, I'm a social media naysayer. I think you really do have to be with other people. I have other studies I've done that show that more and more. I think it's an inconvenient truth, because it would be really nice to be able to fix social isolation with technological mediation, and maybe in 30 years we can, but in the current cohort, that does not look like the way things are working, at least to me in my read of it. Okay, I have a lot of collaborators. I've had a lot of support from the National Institute on Aging, and I cannot thank them enough, both for what they've done to support my work and what they've done to give us this opportunity to talk about this important issue today. And I need to thank my various local sponsors as well, including both of the major centers at UT, and certainly, again, the NIH. And I'm going to stop there and just thank everyone.
Great, thanks so much, Karen. Next up, we have now Compernolle from NORC. And it's just a reminder to folks, if you have questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom there. You're welcome to put in your questions at any time.
Thanks for that, Karen. We actually cite you and your team's work quite a lot. So it's fun to be able to follow you and have this opportunity to share a kind of our contribution to this larger conversation related to momentary loneliness and kind of what we know about it and how we might be able to intervene. Today, I'll be sharing results from a series of studies on Home Alone Together, differential links between momentary contexts and real-time loneliness among older adults during versus before the COVID-19 pandemic. This series of papers really was a function of my amazing colleagues. Kate Cagney is PI, now at Michigan. Louise Hockley, kind of a nationally renowned scholar on loneliness, and a colleague at NORC, as well as Laura Finch, also at NORC. So kind of following up on Karen's wonderful presentation, what is loneliness? Loneliness is often defined as a discrepancy between one's desired and then actual or achieved level of social contact or connection. It is important to note that it is distinct from social isolation, which is kind of a more objective measure of social connectedness. And so while they greatly overlap, they should be considered separately. They are increasingly prevalent, the experience, kind of a U-shape across the life course, with about a third of adults between ages 65 and 79, and about 50% of adults 80 and older reporting feeling frequently lonely. Loneliness, as again, Karen got to, it's associated with myriad adverse outcomes related to morbidity and mortality. Historically, it has been conceptualized as trait-like, or individuals who kind of have this inherent greater or lesser likelihood of experiencing loneliness. And so studies for a long time have documented key risk factors, including who? So women are more likely to experience loneliness, as well as, when you're home and alone, for example, or if you're in a new place and you don't feel like you belong. What's exciting, and again, kind of as Karen noted, is technological advancements in recent decades have really ushered in a new and exciting opportunity to understand loneliness and its complexities in new ways. We used to just ask, kind of snapshot, how frequently did you feel a series of things in the last few months? And we can kind of now get insights into how loneliness can vary by duration and frequency. Was it a daily thing or less frequent, as well as intensity, somewhat or not at all? And if you think about momentary loneliness, it sits really on the edge of this duration, kind of more state-like loneliness, and really allowing it to vary moment to moment. And really, this is possible due to recent technological advancements. So earlier studies used beepers, as Karen noted, where respondents got a little ping, and then they were prompted to go respond to a survey, but more recently turned to Palm Pilot's mobile smart devices, as well as kind of new innovative measures using passive assessments, which we use an asterisk for, because really there's this subjectivity component of loneliness. And so we really have to accompany those objective measures with actual reports and feelings. So here, again, my colleagues, we are among the first to investigate then the antecedents, the real-time contexts in which older adults may experience heightened or kind of blips of momentary loneliness. It is the Chicago Health and Aging Study in Real Time, or CHART, and it was designed to understand the social and spatial environments in which older adults spend their time and kind of get a sense of how these activity spaces then shape older adults' health and well-being. We, as this title suggests, is in Chicago, but we actually purposely sampled older adults across 10 select neighborhoods to really maximize social economic status and variation across race and ethnicity. And as you can see here, nearly half the sample identifies as non-Hispanic Black, and a nice distribution across educational attainment. So we collected data across 6 waves. In each wave, 1 through 4 was comprised of an in-depth interview, in-person interview. And then I'll talk in a second, but also we provided a smartphone to collect a week-long, 7 consecutive days of momentary assessments. 3 waves occurred pre-pandemic across 18 months, spanning from about summer 2018 to fall of 2019. And then the pandemic waves occurred actually across 4 months in the fall of 2020. You can see that it was 450 kind of in the initial sample, but about 325, 350 participated in waves 1 through 3, and then 125 across all waves 1 through 6. So kind of what are we trying to collect here in these activity spaces and these momentary assessments? We provided these older adults, again, like Karen provided instruction on how to use the Samsung smartphone. They then responded or received 5 pings randomly timed across 5 set windows throughout the day for 7 consecutive days. We included only EMAs as valid if they were responded to within 30 minutes of the ping and took fewer than 30 minutes to complete. So it really amounted to about 13,000 EMAs in waves 1 through 3, and a little bit more than 13,000 EMAs among respondents who participated in all 6 waves and contributed a number of EMAs in each of the waves. So when it comes to momentary loneliness, again, different from these historical assessments where you ask the frequency with which individuals may have felt they were lacking social connection, they received a ping, and they were asked a series of 5 to 7 short questions, including at the time of the ping, did you feel lonely? With response items, again, getting at this momentary intensity, so not at all to vary. We also asked them where they were and who they were with. Our studies then similarly accounted for a number of key covariates known to associate with health and well-being and individual social connectedness. So we included baseline interview items related to gender, race, ethnicity, educational attainment, and age. And then across these interviews, we included time-varying measures of marital, employment, and physical health status. So our first paper, we kind of took the established literature and did ask if these associations were consistent with real-time contexts. And we did indeed find that being home and or alone in that moment was associated with increased risk of heightened momentary loneliness as expected. What's interesting is we actually found that the benefits of being outside the home and or with others were weaker for those who identified as non-Hispanic Black or women. So these individuals just did not kind of reap the same benefits, and they also conversely experienced these loneliness-inducing contexts of being home or alone, not as adversely. So here we build off of these this existing research, and we ask, during versus before the pandemic, did older adults experience more intense momentary loneliness? We then ask kind of this differential exposure question, were they more or less likely to be momentarily at home or alone? And last, just thinking about this established association, were these loneliness-inducing contexts on loneliness more or less strong during COVID versus before? We use multi-level regression models with EMAs nested within respondents, linear regression for questions 1 and 3, and logistic regression for research question 2. So what do we find? In general, I do have to note on kind of the axis of loneliness intensity, in general, older adults report not feeling intense loneliness on a scale of 1 to 4. What's interesting is more than half of respondents report at least one kind of blip of momentary loneliness. And so it does suggest that these individuals are kind of passing in and out of very discrete moments of loneliness. And we do find that bivariate statistics suggest that older adults were significantly lonelier or experienced more loneliness during COVID versus before. We also found they were significantly more likely to be at home. Almost 80% of EMAs were reported while they were at home. And interestingly, and this is a little bit different than Karen's, is we found that they were actually alone a little bit more than half of the time, and that was both before and during the pandemic. So when it comes to multivariate models, we find very, very similar results, and this kind of accounts for those key covariates. But again, model 1 shows that during the pandemic, older adults did report more loneliness than before. They also reported more loneliness when they were at home, as well as alone. So this is very consistent with our previous findings, as well as the literature. Moving on to differential exposure, we did again find that older adults were significantly more likely to be at home, and they were not more or less likely to be alone, which is interesting. Moving then on to our third research question, kind of how older adults experience these loneliness-inducing contexts before versus during COVID. And you can see the main effects of COVID, and then their real-time social and physical contexts remain significant and positive. They all kind of are associated with more intense loneliness. But you can see then that there is this interesting negative interaction in that older adults experience these loneliness-inducing contexts less adversely during COVID. So they weren't as they did not impact their loneliness as negatively during COVID. And the same can be said for their social accompaniment. We take these social and physical contexts and kind of create a 2x2 cell, and to understand kind of how these then compare relative to being home and alone, kind of the context that is correlated with the biggest risk factor for loneliness. And we find some interesting things, that being outside the home and or being with others, it did protect against loneliness, but it did not protect to the same extent. Particularly noteworthy is the physical context effects. Reductions in response to being outside the home were interestingly very, very small. And then what's most interesting is that being alone and outside the home then provided virtually no protection relative to being home and alone. And this is kind of before and during COVID. Conversely, because I think that it's a little bit, I think it might be more intuitive to compare to being outside the home with others, but you can again see that being at home and alone is not as detrimental during versus before. And again, home and alone virtually provides no difference when it comes to momentary loneliness. So high level, what did we find? One is loneliness is really still skewed towards the not very lonely. That said, individuals still really experience these blips, and significantly more often and kind of more intensely during COVID. We found they were more likely to be at home, nearly 4/5 of the EMAs, but no difference in how they spent their time as far as social accompaniment. And we found that the loneliness-inducing contexts significantly were less detrimental during COVID, with physical context being particularly noteworthy. So what does this mean, and what do we do about it? We don't test this, which I appreciate that Karen's study does and able to provide interesting insights, but we can speculate. And one is that these older adults really might have adopted and been part of this technology adoption acceleration during COVID. Wonderful programs to get them online, get them to digitally connect, really might have made being at home less lonely. A second is really, it's an interesting idea, but if we are all kind of sharing similar pandemic guidelines to keep our distance, be home, not really engage, there's something about this shared experience. We are home alone together. And so it might be less isolating when you think about yourself as not really alone in this experience. Another, of course, is just what public spaces and shared spaces were and looked like and felt like. They were just qualitatively different during the pandemic. So in general, these findings really provide new insights into what loneliness looked like among older adults during COVID, and really these weakened benefits of being outside the home. In general, the results provide insights into kind of how we might think about intervening in the future, specifically promoting social connectivity at home. Again, kind of thinking in context with Karen, but really that there is a subpopulation that does benefit. So if you are home, you don't have those connections, really thinking about how to get them connected. And again, to really, really think about how to foster social cohesion and safe walkable spaces and really reimagining these shared public spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Nell. Our third and final speaker is Steve Cole, UCLA.
Guys have my screen sharing available yet?
Nell, you may
There we
need to
go.
stop sharing in order
it says
so
someone
that
needs.
Steve can share his.
Sorry, was that a note for me?
Yeah, we need you to stop sharing so I can start.
I'm so sorry. I
I
thought I
No
did.
problem at all.
I
There
thought
we
I
go.
did. Got it.
All right. So last up to bat here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the physical dimensions of loneliness and social isolation and how they also operated during the pandemic. I'm not going to be talking about older adults today. I'll show you some research that was done to understand essentially how social connection operated during the pandemic period, mostly in the context of college students, but in sort of an axis of activity that's actually been highly relevant to older adults who were lonely. And it actually began in collaboration with Louise Hockley and John Cacioppo in their work, trying to understand both the determinants of loneliness in their Chicago research context, as well as the physiological processes that lead to those notable epidemiologic risks described earlier. So as part of that research, we actually looked into how the human immune system was operating in lonely people, because the immune system is now recognized as playing a significant role in many of the diseases that the epidemiology connects to social isolation. And we found now almost 20 years ago that there were in fact very marked systematic differences in how the human genome was operating in the white blood cells of people who were lonely and socially isolated. These are data from essentially you can think of it as like a molecular epidemiologic study looking at how white blood cells change their gene expression levels, their messenger RNA levels, across all 20,000 genes in the human genome. And all this is really saying is there's about 200 or so genes, so not a huge number, but a couple hundred is still enough to change the way your body works. About 70 or so genes in that study, systematically more active in people who were exposed to high levels of loneliness, about 130 genes less active. What we find in general, both in that study and in subsequent research over the last maybe 15 or 20 years or so, is that in general, lonely, socially isolated people show greater activity of inflammatory genes, probably related to stress biology, as I'll explain in a moment, and less activity of genes that are involved in defending the body against viral infections, type 1 interferons and genes that encode certain types of antibodies. Although we bumped into this pattern initially in the context of loneliness, it turns out this is not specific to loneliness. We see much the same kind of thing in a wide variety of other adverse life circumstances where people are feeling threatened or insecure for an extended period of time. So living in poverty, being exposed to PTSD or life-threatening illness, chronic stress, anxiety, early life adversity, many, many kinds of adverse life circumstances seem to call forth the same kind of molecular response from the human genome. And in follow-up studies, we've actually been able to map out pretty well how this all takes place. I won't go into too much detail, but suffice it to say, it looks like much of this effect is driven by the sense of threat that loneliness creates, which again, Hockley and Cacioppo have described in fantastic detail how loneliness isn't just a state of momentary sadness, but actually imperils some of the most fundamental resources necessary for health and well-being in human beings. And your brainstem notices that. It fires off threat responses into the body through the autonomic nervous system, releasing neuroeffector molecules such as norepinephrine and epinephrine in various environments that eventually interact with receptors on the surface of immune cells and kick off signaling pathways within the body that end up within the cells, that end up increasing the transcription of genes involved in inflammation and decreasing the transcription of genes involved in antiviral responses. So this is now a reasonably well-established, sort of pathway, not the only one, but certainly one pathway through which loneliness and social isolation can leave a body more vulnerable to disease, especially chronic diseases over the long run. So the question that we had during the pandemic is whether, for obvious reasons, because real life social contact was being throttled back in the ways that we were just discussing, what role you can think of as online or virtual social contact might play in abating these kinds of effects. In other words, can this kind of flow of biological, I guess you can think of it as flow of social hunger through the brain into the body, into gene regulation in the immune system, can that be ameliorated by online social connection during periods where it's aggravated by the sort of reduced availability of offline or real life social connection? So we had a chance to look at this with a colleague of mine, actually a collaborator who had been interested for a long time in video games, which to the older generation will be like, what on earth does that have to do with anything? But when you think about it, video games are actually essentially, a stage in which you get to act out an alternative version of your life relative to the real world. And then there's actually very rich research on the ways in which that can be psychologically beneficial, although can also certainly be toxic in certain contexts. So the folks that were really interested, the guy that was really driving this research is an anthropologist at Colorado State University named Jeffrey Snodgrass. And he loves video games. He loves gamer culture. He loves trying to understand what people are experiencing doing and what their identity really is when they're in these, you can think of as alternative life circumstances relative to real world life. So Jeff was actually, sort of particularly, he loves this stuff. So he was, sort of like, okay, well, we're forced into the virtual world here, but, still that could be a great thing, right? I mean, he'd been studying, gamers for, I guess now years, trying to, sort of extract both the risky things we've heard about, but also the benefits that keep drawing people back to these virtual worlds, these avatars of their own identity in this sort of, in some sense, aspirational world that you can build online. So during the pandemic, he thought, let's start looking at the biology of loneliness and see whether it is abated by this kind of virtual social connection. So to test that idea, he recruited 142 Colorado State University undergraduates who were, more or less living in lockdown at that point, and sent them some blood sampling kits that we sent him. These, I don't know if you guys have seen these, but these little micro fluidic blood sampling tools that you can kind of poke on your arm, press a button, and it'll draw a tiny amount of blood and dry it out. And that will allow us to measure that CTRA gene expression profile, that sort of loneliness-associated threat defense profile that I showed in that first heat plot. And so he also collected online surveys measuring online social connection, how lonely versus connected you feel online, how much positive social status did you have, either in recreational or educational context online, how much you use the internet, as well as in-person or offline social connection. You can tell Jeff's reference point is online, so the real world is this offline alternative in his mind. In any case, he was measuring real life loneliness with the UCLA loneliness scale, as we just described, as well as dimensions of personal well-being that stem from social connection or social embeddedness. So a concept described by Corey Keyes, well-being researcher, who really introduced this idea of social well-being, as well as more classic kind of sociometric parameters like the number of friends people had. And when we analyzed the data, this is what ended up happening. As we've seen in many cases in previous research, loneliness was indeed associated with increased activity of those inflammatory genes and a reciprocal decreased expression of genes involved in antiviral responses. Above and beyond that, people who had a strong sense of what's called social well-being, or a sort of important, meaningful embeddedness within a kind of a culture or a community around them, showed reduced activity of that threat-related molecular profile. People who had more friends also showed reduced activity of that profile. So far, so good. Most of the relationships that we'd seen in previous studies of real-world social connection and its converse in loneliness were coming through in this sample. So what did we see with the online measures? Well, we worked hard. Jeff is definitely an evangelist for the online social world, but honestly, we just could not get anything to come out in there. So online loneliness versus connectedness wasn't really associated either positively or negatively with this threat-related gene expression signature, nor were measures of what he was calling consonance, but you can roughly think of as prestige or status online in either leisure or educational contexts. In fact, not even the amount of time you spent online, either streaming entertainment or in more active things, social media, playing games, having voice or video conversations, collaborating in school or work activities, nothing in the virtual world really ended up tracking with what was going on in our molecular interior, if you will. So real world loneliness was still exerting its effects. Real world connection and togetherness was still exerting its effects. But this virtual world, which can undoubtedly do much for people's sense of psychological connectedness, seems to not be supplying sort of like a meaningful bump in the real world connection and its role in shaping interior molecular biology. So at least with regard to our original hypothesis, apparently the answer is no. This, at least for this particular readout of this sort of molecular threat signature, real world social connection does seem to continue to matter for it, but online social connection really didn't affect it much. Now, that said, there are some significant limitations to what we can extrapolate from this study. It's a cross-sectional correlational study, so obviously we can't draw any causal conclusions about whether loneliness is causing this molecular signature, or whether, as is actually not completely insane to imagine, the molecular signature might be potentially influencing loneliness. It's certainly possible. We can talk about that later if people have questions about it. These results come from young adults, and so it's unclear if and how these results would pertain to older adults. Obviously, the COVID social distancing era was a very atypical isolation condition where isolation and loneliness was essentially delivered by policy instructions as opposed to either by the sort of the cultural or social ecosystem in which we live, or even more so in the context of chronic loneliness by our experiences of the social world in exactly the way that Louise and John had long analyzed these perceptions of the world outside us, leading us to some extent, mistrust it and withdraw from it, that being the sort of the core psychology of chronic loneliness. These were all self-reported social parameters, so we were not lucky enough to have those excellent objective, location or activity measures that folks were talking about in the earlier presentations. That said, the self-report nature of these social parameters was true for both the online parameters that did seem to track with this molecular risk, as well as the offline parameters, which did not. So that doesn't seem to be sort of a methodological confound per se with the pattern of results that we actually see. And then finally, it's definitely important to note that we're observing self-generated individual differences in all of these social connections, and that these don't necessarily inform about what the effect of an intervention would be within individuals. These are really fundamentally between individual differences that we're looking at here. So with that, let me thank you for your attention. Thank Jeff and his colleagues at Colorado State, John and Louise, for the magnificent work they've done for so many years, creating, I think, the psychological and psychobiological context for everything that we were doing in this study, as well as the other collaborators who've worked on mapping that kind of biology that I described earlier, and the folks who supported this research at the National Science Foundation, the NIH, and the Foundation for Psychocultural Research. Thank you all.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. And so, Lillian, yeah, I see that you're bringing our panelists back. For those who just joined recently, we encourage you to type any questions you have into the Q&A box. But if anybody would like to speak, if it's easier to ask your question verbally, you can use the raise hand feature and we can try to unmute you to answer your questions that way. So I'm going to turn to you, Karen, first. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. The first one is, have you looked at these results stratified by people who do and don't have kids?
So keeping in mind the cohort I'm looking at, the vast majority have kids. So there's not enough variability on that. But where we can get variability is whether you live alone. We can also get some variability on marital status. And granted, marriage, being married, is highly correlated with living alone, but not always, because in this cohort, sometimes you have a spouse who's been in long-term care. So we look at both of those phenomena. Living alone is a very different experience in many different ways. And so we've been looking at things like TV viewing. That is the screen of choice. People have the TV on 6 to 7 hours a day, people over 65. And that's very different if you live alone. And actually, it's better in some ways when you live alone. So when you live with someone else, you tend to watch TV with that person. Again, we've got that activity thing, and you tend to be very sedentary. So it's having that effect that we think it has. When you live alone, you tend to have the TV on when you're lonely, and it does not. You do it alone, and you do not show the activity decrease. So we think it's like CNN at the airport. You've just got it on in the background, but again, we're not seeing the effect. You think, well, let's put a voice on in the background. They're still just as lonely. So we do have some differences in that regard, and we've dug deeper. I could tell you about marital status and language and so on, and there are differences. And just to your point about children, I'll give you a quick one from someone else's literature that again speaks to what we've been talking about. There was an increase in video use and so on for upper socioeconomic 65 to about 80-year-olds. There was actually a decrease in, this is one study again, but this is really intriguing. There's a decrease for people in their 80s and for lower socioeconomic. And they're attributing it to not having access to someone who can come over and install that. So that suggests that it was the kids who were doing it. So a long answer, giving you a bunch of data out there, but no, I didn't actually look at it myself because I couldn't.
And also for you, Karen, is did you use a chatbot that interacts with the respondent through text or for audio? This person asks, have you tested whether a chatbot that interacts with the user through audio has a different impact than text does?
I should say that was not my research. That was just sort of something I did to have fun with ChatGPT and then asked it, and I read all the literature. What I speculate is that it would not help to have it orally, in large part because we're finding that phone has at best a neutral effect, at worst a counter effect. The other thing, part of the reason I'm not a chatbot fan is that when I think about what social engagement does, is it stimulates certain cognitive facets. And so we have something called the positivity effect, where older adults attend to positive stimuli more than young adults do and more than they do to negative. So you could say, well, look, the ChatGPT just gives them that positive, but maybe that impedes the functions that they were using. And maybe it is harmful in some way because it's not engaging the way that social engagement pulls different things out of us. And so I'm pretty dubious about it either way, but I'm speculating. We need more data.
And yeah, as we're waiting for more questions to come in, I have a couple for the panelists and one for you, Nell, which is you've got data for pre-COVID and during COVID, and I I wondered if you, maybe you mentioned this, but are there plans to collect data post-COVID to see if the patterns have changed? Are they the same as they were before the pandemic, or has COVID sort of changed things in some way, or do we not know?
I really appreciate this question. And actually, for anybody listening, chart is one of the best data sets that I feel like I'm happy to talk. There's so much opportunity, even with the existing data, or to build off of it. So one thing we're really eager to do is, I have a colleague who's actually started to look at the GPS coordinates of EMAs. So you can actually start to look at where they are physically, not just their reports of where they're at or what they're doing. So we would like to actually leverage like objective neighborhood data to get a better sense of, are older adults of color navigating into neighborhoods? What do they look like? And why do they feel lonelier there than, for example, their white peers? And so really, I feel like it's a two-part answer. And one is there's so much we'd like to do with the data we have. And then two is absolutely to expand to see. I note that actually, and I'm curious, Karen's experience, the study team had experienced real challenges in recruiting. And then actually, just like you said, Karen, you're recruiting older adults who may or may not have their own smart device. And so you're training them. And so we actually had a learning curve of some older adults were at church. They forgot their phone when they got pinged, went home to get their phone, went back to church to respond to the EMA, so like, I actually think that whether it's this cohort, however many years later, might be challenging, but a lot of lessons learned to think about how we can expand on our findings and design here in new ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I should add, I had University of Michigan's ISR do this sample for me. So I'm not that great individually, but as you know, NORC, ISR, you all are great at that kind of thing. But yes, absolutely. And we're trying to get into the field, and we could just have a whole seminar on things that are technologically challenging, and particularly when you give them to older adults. But it's just astonishing because we all just take it for granted that you can just use this thing for anything. And when you're in the field, that is not the case, as you know better than I do now.
And Steve, someone raised the question that was in my mind too after your presentation, which is the why. So why is it that in-person interaction is beneficial, but why? Can you speculate on why this online interaction is not?
Yeah, although speculate is all I can do. I mean, I have been fascinated that there has been so little research on this basic question of what is different in in-person contact. Why does it have such different effects, both for our psychological, emotional process? It seems as though the digital world can, approach the in-person world in things like cognitive engagement and complexity. What it can't seem to do as well is generate the same sense of sort of emotional connection. And there's actually a couple of reasons why that is that are just related to the physical interface. But the short version of the answer is that the format of digital communication is actually highly atypical of the format of in-person communication. So just to take one example, when two people are together in person, they almost never do what's called mad dogging. They don't look at each other face on and stare right into one another's eyes. In fact, they avoid doing that because that's historically been, if you are an emotions theorist, that is actually a threat signature. People together tend to sort of usually not be straight looking at one another. They usually sit side by side or sort of at an angle, and they sort of jointly view the world around them. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in the way online communication takes place that is subtly rattling to the human emotional system, perhaps even more than the human cognitive system. Not that cognition is perfect, but it's this subtle world of the cues that are getting sent, the cues that aren't getting sent, the lack of a shared ecosystem, which provides a weird kind of bonding. In other words, we're not in the same physical place. We have to communicate perceptions to one another that are not, we don't normally need to do that. They just kind of flow into us in parallel. So this idea in communications theory, they call this joint reference, this idea that you and I share something in common, we're together. And that seems to have a weird, natural sort of almost threat relaxation process. When people are together sharing experience, that gets picked up very easily in the kind of social psychophysiology. So I won't go on too much longer about this, but my best guess is that there's something in the kind of the interpersonal format of digital interaction that is either, so we often think of it as like underproducing what real world contact involves. That may be true, but I think it's at least as worrisome that it may be overproducing an atypical kind of contact that actually knocks off this more restful, consoling togetherness experience that people have.
And now you just responded to a question that I think I'd also like to open up to the other panelists. If you want to say a few words about this, because I think people would like to hear about what type of a tech intervention might be beneficial in terms of improving social relationships.
Thanks, Mark, for that. I answered Beth. I thought that this was a really thoughtful and interesting question, and it automatically put it in the answered folder. So if folks want to look there, and I certainly am interested in hearing Steve and Karen's thoughts. I can say that there is a lot of interest, particularly in the private industry, in trying to address social isolation and loneliness with virtual digital technologies. It is mixed and it's complicated to try and facilitate real social connection. There's promise. I think they're headed more recently in the kind of social robot, digital pet arena. I think that as these wonderful co-presenters shared, there's a big depends, and it can be helpful for some, but it's really facilitating and getting back to that in-person connection. So I'm curious to hear Steve and Karen's thoughts.
I think Steve really nailed a lot of what we would need to do. I think there's some other things, is that, it's technology. And so once you sort of get over maybe the novelty, it's hard to, we love anthropomorphizing, but it's hard to sustain that. And the thing I was getting at earlier, real human beings are complicated. And so it may be the case that any given technology has to parse out. So you can get a robot that can help you do the dishes. There's a degree to which there's some research, my colleague Kara Burnett has done some research that conflict can be engaging and life-sustaining, if you will. And so there's just too much complexity, I think, for us to substitute. What I do think we're going to be able to do, though, is there are people who have no one. And maybe they have dementia and they have no one. And there we're not talking about how can we get someone to peak optimization. We're talking about a very low threshold. And in that regard, we may be able to do very low threshold things. I don't think that's where we're currently trying to intervene. I think we're trying to show all of our newest, smartest, whatever, and we're aiming at populations that don't really need it. So I think that's some of the problem is what our goal is. And optimizing, I don't think we're going to get there. Getting from the bare minimum, going from 0 to 0.5 or 1, that might be possible.
Yeah, I'd like to amplify on what Karen just said. I think that, and I worked in the Silicon Valley for 11 years, and there is just this messianic belief that they will be able to replace human beings with technology. They think that's a good thing. And if you know some of these people, you wouldn't be surprised that they think it's a good thing. They're often people that are actually not that comfortable interacting with others, but also very ambitious and creative and all that kind of stuff. But that little kind of editorial aside, I agree that probably the biggest opportunity for technology is not to try and replace human beings, but to supplement human beings, to do the things that human beings can't do. The great example is caregiving for an Alzheimer's patient. This destroys the psychology of caregivers so badly, it destroys their body. It is an intense hypervigilance demand to do that kind of thing. That's the kind of stuff technology loves. It loves doing the same thing day in, day out, every single second. It doesn't need to sleep. So I increasingly think about handing off things as opposed to replacing things. What are the things in life that we can get technology to do so that we can spend either more of our time or better time doing the things that only we can do? In Silicon Valley, there's this big concern with this idea of the uncanny valley, that as you make technology more and more similar to real life, it becomes actually more and more freaky and alienating. And so I'm doubly convinced of Karen's point that I don't think we'll be able to improve technology until we get animatronic human beings that seem very empathic and all that other kind of stuff, because that will not change the fact that they're not real human beings. They couldn't possibly care about us. And reciprocal care is the core of the safety signaling that shuts down all of that biology I talked about earlier. You will never feel loved by a robot. You will never feel cared about by ChatGPT. We know this. That's why we can get information from them. They're fabulous at processing information, but they are not going to make your brainstem feel like everything is okay and this person will take care of you when you really need help. So that, I think, is a fundamental challenge that I just don't see anybody thinking about realistically, except we academics who keep saying, why do we keep coming up short on this technological utopia that we were promised?
I want to add one thing to what Steve just said about mutual care. So again, one of my colleagues, Sehan here at UT Austin, has been looking at the positive effect of volunteering. And one of my grad students recently showed that when people are beginning to decline physically, being able to give advice is very helpful. And so the ChatGPT is going to have to be programmed to need us for us to also feel that fulfillment. In positive ways, not the caregiver ways you're referring to, Steve, but
Oh, it can only pretend to need us because all it needs is electrons, and people will always, like, you can work up the gimmick all you want, but in the end, it's like going to Disneyland,
Now, I think this question is for you about how do you disentangle momentary loneliness versus chronic loneliness? Is there a difference there? Is one good enough proxy for the more problematic chronic loneliness?
It's a really wonderful question. And I just have to return back to Louise Hockley. I mean, everybody here has worked with her. She's really just a leading scholar and is a wonderful colleague in this conversation. And she and colleagues just created an evolutionary theory of loneliness, the idea that we are fundamentally social beings and we're all like, loneliness is kind of a similar signal to hunger, and it just is meant to poke you and say something about your social environment isn't right. And there's just something that you need to reevaluate in order to survive and thrive as a human being, because you need others in order to do that. So it's in that sense, like loneliness, we all experience it, and it's not in and of itself a bad thing. Because and actually, Karen, it's interesting that your study didn't support this idea that for many, loneliness is a signal to, I need to reach out to somebody. I'm going to go for a walk. I need to check on I need to reevaluate and change something about my social relationships to kind of meet that need, if that makes sense. And then I was just going to say, if that doesn't work, then you're really at risk of this loop of loneliness, which we can talk about. Karen, if you want, I don't know.
Yeah,
if you want
I was just going to say,
yeah.
You raise a good point. I mean, we are doing that sort of 3-hour ecological momentary assessment, which means they may be in a certain day context. And so I do think we'd have to look at it differently, because one of the things that we're finding, right, is that the circadian or the schedule is doing some determination, which implies that it's not so much whether I personally carry loneliness. I mean, that's kind of what we found, is that your own motivation, at least in our modern world, is maybe not as easily, overcome. And that's an interesting question in and of itself that I hadn't really thought through.
I appreciate just that. And so speaking to that too is if you can't overcome it, then what happens is, and this is where Steve's research is amazing, mixed with the opportunities to look more into momentary loneliness and the processes through which it operates. And that if you start then to be in this hypervigilant mode, you start to interpret your social interactions differently than those who are not in fight or flight and not lonely. And so there's this really kind of unfair feedback loop for people who are lonely. They start to kind of distance themselves more and it feeds back into itself. And that is when the chronic loneliness does really start to have these effects that we see. But I do want to say momentary loneliness, the more and more we're learning about it, there's evidence that if you experience some of these blips during the day, you have worse sleep and you feel less rested in the morning the next morning. So whether they operate in the same way, Steve, we can talk about that, we should talk. And I think it has its own kind of features, but in and of itself is also not good.
I'm going to just step in because I always get the question about personality. What if you're an introvert? And Julian Holt-Lonstead, who did that meta-analysis I showed you earlier, once said, the fact that you want to be alone doesn't make it good for you. People want all kinds of things that aren't good for them. They love to eat French fries. I mean, there's all kinds of things we do that are, and so the argument would be that, it's not that everyone has to pretend they're an extrovert, but you can't shut yourself at home with your video games because you're feeling shy. There has to be some degree to which, if we're going to intervene, we actually have to get people away from the technologies, perhaps, and encourage some kind of, other interactions.
Yeah, that is the irony of young people's loneliness, which is almost a completely distinct syndrome from older people's loneliness. And that has really risen, as we all know, dramatically in recent years. And it does not come from a lack of social input. It comes from a different kind or quality of social input delivered at mass volume through, media, but that does not end up leaving people feeling safe or cared for or, well, or often even optimistic about prospects for that. And so as Nell was talking about earlier, it's quite easy to kick off this pessimistic cycle about social prospects that, is, again, exactly feeds this kind of vicious cycle. So I think, there has been much discussion of this idea that loneliness is a kind of hunger that, if not resolved, can become its own form of anorexia. In other words, you lose the motivation at some point if you don't, sort of recover the kind of the homeostatic set point that your social thermometer is trying to kind of defend and manage.
Well, the questions are slowing down. I did just want to maybe end on one note that I was thinking of when you started mentioning Silicon Valley, Steve, and all of the complexity here. It occurs to me that all of the work you're doing is highly relevant to current policy debates and all of the discussion right now about AI and how it might be impacting our daily lives. But the fact that there's a lot we don't know, it really, to me, shows the importance of doing this social science research and not just, we could spend a lot of money developing new tools or apps or technologies to improve social connection, but what you've been presenting today really shows the importance of grounding this in what actually works, which is not always what you'd expect, I think, is what I'm taking away from this. So yeah, it's not really a question, just I just really appreciate you all joining and
It's
sharing.
not a question. I do have an answer for you on that. So I think one of the things that is an opportunity is, instead of thinking of the sort of the digital world as an alternative to or a replacement for the real world, I think the biggest opportunities we have is to use the digital world as an extender of real world social relationships. And that actually it did do moderately well during the COVID epidemic. That would have been a lot more painful if we did not have the digital tools. If that whole thing had happened 10 years earlier, I think the social, cultural, and economic carnage would have just been dramatically higher. So I think the opportunity space, one heuristic is to think about what can we use technology to extend the good parts of real world relationships when we can't actually physically realize, almost the same way the telephone transformed cultural and social mobility.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that's a great way to end. It's a more optimistic note. Karen, Nell, Steve, thank you so much for joining to talk about this important and timely topic. And I want to thank everyone who attended. We did record this, so we'll share out the recording, and I think we can share the slides as well if with everyone in the next few days. So thanks again, and we hope to see you again soon at our next event. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.